Good evening and welcome to another developer interview here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. My allergies are flaring up right now, so there may be extra coughing added into this episode, but we have another great chat lined up. We're going to be talking puzzle design and puzzle games. My guest is working on the puzzle Metroidvania Gentoo Rescue, and they are on to chat about it, and I'm sure any other puzzle-y related things that come to mind. So please welcome to the cast, Jagriff. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Tail end of Next Fest, so it has been a very busy week, and I'm happy for it to be the weekend. And still about a month and a half or so away from release, so still a lot of work to do. But yeah, just this Next Fest has been quite a grind.
Mm-hmm. And I know that feeling as I'm covering as many Next Fest games as I get my hands on. So there are no weekends around here, at least until this coverage is over. But it's a pleasure to chat with you. Jagriff reached out to me about wanting to cover the game, and as I always say, if you are a developer working on a game and you'd like to come on and chat about it, or for me to cover it, please get in touch any way you can. So, since this is your first time on the cast, could you tell a little bit about kind of like who you are and what is your background when it comes to game dev?
Sure. So yeah, I'm a bit older. I'm a new game dev though, but I'm in my 30s. My background is I went to school for mathematics and computer science, and I work as a software developer. Of course, a big part of my background was also gaming. I mainly liked like competitive games. I played a lot of competitive FPS, RTS, but then also puzzle games. Baba Is You was one that I really took to, and yeah, I just fell in love with that game. And so yeah, I played that back in 2020, and here we are. I guess 3 years after 2020, 2023 was when I started my game. Inspired by Baba Is You, and yeah, I mean that's kind of how I got here.
Mm-hmm. So, what kind of attracted you to like a puzzle game as being like your first? Like, is a Gen 2 like your first actual game, or you worked on other games before?
Now this is yeah completely my first game. It's taken 2 years, and I've put all my effort into this one game, which isn't really recommended for new game developers. Usually, you want to start with smaller projects that you can finish in a couple of months or even weeks. So I didn't take that advice, and yeah. So as far as what attracted me to the puzzle game, so one is the scope is relatively small. At least I mentioned my background is mostly in like competitive multiplayer games, which I definitely would not recommend a brand new solo developer to get into. So yeah, relatively the scope is quite a bit smaller with puzzle games, and Baba Is You again is a big inspiration, and that really inspired me to make a puzzle game. And then additionally, my background. So actually, we'll probably talk about this some more, but I think there's a lot of relationships between like teaching or learning or even doing research mathematics and puzzle games. The way you go from one step to the next is you sort of build upon this foundation. And so I think my background was well suited for this, even though I haven't studied game design or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've interviewed several like puzzle developers over the years, and like puzzle design is a very challenging way of building a game, not just in terms of kind of the gameplay that goes into it, but the methodology that you have to try and instill in the player. Like I've interviewed Zach Barr from Zachtronics multiple times. What was her name? Gwen Frey, who is working on I think a Sokoban style one, and like part of the challenge of like creating a puzzle game, I think to kind of ask you a question where you were just talking about in terms of your background mathematics, is kind of I guess like explaining but not explaining the rules to the player. Because there's always that kind of issue of is the person actually figuring out what I want them to? Or are they just, throwing things against the wall and, the 1 out of 75 chance they got that lucky break, but they have no idea how they solved it.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. Actually, when I first started, I didn't really do a good job with puzzle design, as you do when you're starting anything brand new. I had some family play test it, and one of my nieces, Madison, I now call this phenomenon Madison proving a puzzle. So let me go back. She would just spam random moves, and sometimes she would solve a puzzle just like on the controller, just spamming as many moves as she could, and fall into a solution. And I was like, oh yeah, I need to definitely make sure to avoid that, or no one can accidentally solve the puzzle. For Gentoo Rescue, a big part of that is just having multiple characters. Um, so if you just move a single character like you would do when you're spamming moves, then there's no way you could solve it. There's other solutions as well, but yeah, that's definitely a big concern. It's hard to set up a puzzle that teaches the player without just giving it away. There's always this dynamic of how do I make a puzzle that's not trivial but also not impossible, because that's you want to definitely get in between those two. Very it's a very big broad range there. So it can't be trivial because obviously there's nothing really being taught if you don't struggle a little bit, and then obviously the puzzle needs to be possible. So finding that balance from there takes a lot of thought going into it, and then a lot of play testing.
Mm-hmm. And it's that kind of in between, as you said, of it being like very simple, your brain just turns off and trying to solve it, versus being very brain melty. That is oftentimes like very hard to get right for a lot of puzzle games, because there are puzzle games out there that kind of boast here's 10,000 different puzzles for you to do. And in today's market, that's kind of a turnoff for people who don't want to spend the next, 2 months trying to just do simple puzzles. But conversely, you have puzzle games that are about, the over the top, very challenging. Again, going back to Zachtronics and the whole Zack-like subgenre, where there are people who love those puzzles, but there's a lot of people who, the second they see something like that, they're out here. They're not even going to try and solve it.
Yes, in terms of like the Zack-like puzzles, I haven't actually played one of these games myself, but I'm very intrigued by the concept because there the puzzles are not necessarily solving the problem that's being given. It's more about optimizing your
Yeah.
solution. And so there's just a lot of creativity that a player can apply there. And yeah, it's just the whole concept is very intriguing. I honestly had never even heard of the genre until I really got in this puzzle space.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, once I get some free time, it's on my list of things to look into.
Good luck. That's all I'm going to say there. Now, before I even kind of got a little bit ahead of ourselves, before we get a little bit more into like kind of puzzle design for people listening to us right now, what's kind of the pitch for Gentoo Rescue?
Well, I think I call it a puzzle Metroidvania. I think that already turns some heads a little bit. Like, how can that possibly work? Um, the main issue with the game overall is that I don't have a single like centralizing hook. It's more about just the very tight puzzle design and the exploration of. I mean, I call it really too many mechanics. There's so many mechanics in the game, and that kind of interact with each other in surprising ways. Again, I'm drawing a heavy inspiration from Baba Is You, which is another game which I think of as like a very wide game where there's just so many mechanics, and that it gives you a lot of sort of options to try, but reduces those options by giving you insight into, oh, I need this, I need push here, I need this item to have push, and in Baba Is You's terms, in order to solve this puzzle, and so that gives you clear thoughts of how you can make deducible steps towards the solution. So yeah, Gentoo Rescue. It's a puzzle Metroidvania where the animals, penguins and walruses, can pick up items, and that'll change their behavior. So again, it's pretty much inspired by Baba Is You changing the rules.
Mm-hmm. And excuse me, and one of the big parts that I mentioned in my video showcase about the game from Next Fest is you have this kind of like meta layer of like puzzles within puzzles, and kind of like the map being a puzzle in of itself. And can you talk a little bit more about kind of like setting that up?
Sure. I mean, when I started out, the game was just a very traditional puzzle game where it just had a menu and you go from puzzle one to puzzle two to puzzle three. And I've seen these things that all these different games are doing with um, an overworld where you are in a world and then you can move around and get to puzzles. And I thought more and more about that, and I stumbled onto this idea of what if we just make everything a puzzle. You have one giant like root of this big tree that's a puzzle, and inside there we have other puzzles, and inside those puzzles you might go deeper and so forth. And that kind of came about as a world system, and then I really like how this gives you a lot of meta puzzle solving. It's like I need to get to this puzzle, but I have to solve the puzzle of how do I reach a puzzle. But then naturally, basically, as this was built and doing some iteration on it, realize there's even more you can do with the items as far as moving things from one puzzle to the other. Also, again, I've already mentioned Baba Is You a few times. I'll probably keep doing so, but that's also inspired by Baba Is You as well.
Mm-hmm. And it's like when we get to like that kind of like meta layer of puzzle design, that it really takes on like a different meaning in terms of the puzzle logic and kind of the like pacing and setup for it. As you're aware of, I'm sure everyone watching, when we kind of look at like basic level puzzle design, it is just basically one room, one solution, you're there, get over here, you move on to the next, repeat until the player gets tired or you run out of puzzles. But with the likes of like Baba Is You, Gentoo, there was a game from last year I need to play more of, Isle of the Sea and Sky, which I really did enjoy. There's this idea again of kind of presenting this as not just like a set of linear rooms, but as a world to explore. And that whole concept really does intrigue me because I think it kind of adds a greater sense of presentation that sometimes I think the puzzle genre is kind of lacking in that respect.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I mean, from my point of view, I'm happy to go from room to room, just solving one problem, one completely self-contained problem after another. But that does get old after a while. Even Baba Is You is a super long game, and it takes a long time to get to the sort of open world. Or I wouldn't even call it open world, but it takes a while to get to this aspect of meta puzzling where you don't have to just solve the puzzle. No, you have to solve the puzzle in a very particular manner that sets up a bigger puzzle to be solved. And that aspect is yeah, just so intriguing to me. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, it really does break up the flow. The small self-contained puzzles are really nice for teaching mechanics, but it's always nice to take all of these things you learn in these small puzzles and put them together in a much bigger puzzle piece.
Mm-hmm. So I guess like without like spoiling anything from the game, in terms of like as a developer setting this whole thing up, how do you approach like building like a puzzle into a set of puzzles into a set of puzzles from a design standpoint?
Very carefully and over a long period of time. It's a big challenge. For for Gentoo Rescue, the way the meta mechanics are set up, I was really worried really when I thought about them. I was like, I want to do this. This would be so cool, but the design is going to be almost impossible. And so I really tried to work out some limitations that I could add to these meta mechanics to give me more control. And so for instance, in Gentoo Rescue, a lot of the meta mechanics depend on the animals, the specific animal, either the penguin or the walrus, and also their color. So there's 4 different colors, or technically 5, but one's not controllable. So you have these 8 or 10, depending on how you count it, different animals, and so the meta mechanics will depend on which animal we're focused on. And so essentially, if I have some small self-contained puzzles that I don't want to really be affected or really be part of the meta puzzle, then I can do that. And so that level of control really does make it possible to avoid some big pitfalls that can come out with these meta mechanics. And even Metroidvania, but other puzzle Metroidvanias have these issues as well. The first one is, I know this was a big complaint about Isles of Sea and Sky, is that a player, when they enter a puzzle, they want to know whether it's solvable.
Mm-hmm.
You never want to enter a puzzle and say, "Can I solve this now?" But I'm not sure. Maybe I have to get a power up or something like this. And that's just a giant pitfall. And you can kind of solve this in many different ways. You can give some UI elements or give some hints or something like this. With Gentoo Rescue, I sort of aim to solve it by not even having puzzles like that to begin with that can't be solved without doing something else. Now, that's unavoidable. There are a few that are like that. But in Gentoo Rescue, those puzzles are always super small and super obvious that you can't do it. Like if you don't have the right item, then you have like 2 or 3 states that you can visit, and they're all impossible. So yeah, that's one big focus is avoiding that pitfall. And then the other pitfall is that once you sort of get your power up or you get some mechanism that will make it easier to solve puzzles, is then you can revisit puzzles that you couldn't beat before,
Mm-hmm.
but you should have been able to beat before. But now you can sort of just circumvent all of the difficulty and just cheese the puzzle using some new power up. And so in Gentoo Rescue, whenever this is possible, I actually store both solutions. If you can solve a puzzle by cheesing it, then that's going to be a bonus solution for the puzzle, and the normal intended solution is tracked independently. So if players want to go through and choose a bunch of puzzles, that's great, but that's not going to count towards their sort of main route.
Hmm. And to go back what you said a second ago about walking into a puzzle and not being sure you can solve it or not, that's a common pitfall I see from a lot of kind of like adventure style puzzle games, or kind of like when you're trying to combine puzzle with like another genre. Stuff like what was it? Talos Principle, the Swapper. I know there's a few other ones as well where you can run to this room and it's like, okay, am I figuring out the solution but I'm not doing it right? Or am I doing am I doing the action right, but it's not the right solution? And that can be very frustrating for someone when you're trying to learn kind of like the mechanism for what you're supposed to be doing from puzzle to puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely. Nothing can be more frustrating than feeling stuck but not knowing
Yeah.
why, or not knowing if it's out of your control or not. And once that uncertainty hits, even if you can solve the puzzle, the fact that you aren't certain about it leaves not just an impression on maybe a puzzle where you couldn't have solved, but even ones that you can. And it
Mm-hmm.
sort of just dominates your thought process as you play through the game. And so that's why this has been just such a big point in me trying to avoid this entirely, because that's not how I want my players to feel.
Yeah, and that right there is like something that I think is always like one of like the biggest like causes of churn for a lot of puzzle games, because you'll like it's all fine and dandy and you get stuck on that one annoying puzzle, that one puzzle you have no idea how to solve it. And yes, maybe you will solve it after 10, 20, 40 different tries, but then it lingers in your mind that if this puzzle stumped me completely, what's going to happen to the next puzzle that stumps me? How long is that one going to take? Or the one after that? And I think it's also why we see kind of like very noticeable high churn from a lot of puzzle games along those lines.
Yeah, that is another concern. That's actually I think of as being a little bit separate as far as like a difficulty curve goes. I mean, a lot of games want to start off easy and slowly get harder and slowly get
Mm-hmm.
harder until eventually, when you're in the end game, you solve a hard puzzle. Maybe it took you 30 minutes, an hour, maybe even longer. And what are you rewarded with? Well, the next puzzle is going to be just as hard. And that, I mean, that could be fun sometimes, but yeah, sometimes you need a bit of a dip here and there in the difficulty. And that's one thing that I think Gentoo Rescue benefits from a lot, from having so many mechanics, is that if or whenever a new mechanic is introduced, usually you get some gentler puzzles. And if you want to play like the optional, like much more difficult puzzles in a certain section, you can. But then, as soon as you're like, okay, I need a break, you can move on to a new section where a new mechanic is introduced, and you can, learn something new, but also be greeted with, some more approachable puzzles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like when I see that in a lot of games, because again, it does provide that kind of break or that lull between like having very extreme or very challenging gameplay. And it also, I think, helps in terms of keeping the game feeling fresh. Am I stuck on the 20th Towers of Annoy puzzle? Well, let me go do the jumping puzzle instead for a little bit. And it can be very difficult from a design perspective to kind of build like all these different varieties. So I guess my next question for you then is like with Gentoo Rescue, how and this is some quite like to ask a lot of puzzle developers, like how do you define what is considered an easy puzzle versus a hard or brain melting one?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. There's a lot of things to consider. So, of course, like the number of moves it takes to solve the puzzle, that's a good metric. It's not the only metric, but that one alone can tell you a lot. If you can solve a puzzle in 4 moves, it's going to be hard to make that puzzle really, really, really hard. Although there is a puzzle in the demo right now of Gentoo Rescue that I've seen people stuck on for a few minutes that is only 4 moves long, so it's not impossible.
I think I may have been
Another
stuck on that puzzle too.
another metric is, I mean, another thing is to consider like how many characters you have, because in Gentoo Rescue the characters move independently, and so when you have independent movement, all of a sudden you have to worry about move order. Move order becomes a big deal. If I want to move the red guy before the blue guy, or the blue guy before the green guy, like these sorts of questions, it can really just blow up the potential possibilities in a certain puzzle. And so if a puzzle takes 4 moves and there's only one animal, it's probably a really easy puzzle. If it takes 4 moves and there's 4 animals and each of those moves is with a different animal, which is the case for the puzzle in the demo, then it can be a bit harder. And then apart from those two things, there's a handful of other things I consider. Another one is like the size of not just the puzzle, but the size of like the state space. So when I say state space, I mean just like if you take all the different permutations of how the puzzle can appear as the player makes moves, like how many possibilities are there? And if you have a puzzle where there's just a ton of possibilities, then that's probably going to be a bit harder because it becomes more likely the player might find themselves in completely wrong direction, but they can keep exploring. So whenever I want to make a puzzle a little bit easier, what I do is just try to chop off that entire part of the state space, where I say, okay, if you reach it here, the puzzle will be obviously impossible, and you won't be able to progress any further. So I do that a lot with just removing a wall so that the animals will fall in the water when you don't want that. And so in doing so, you not only limit the state space, but you also make it so that the player is aware that it is currently impossible. They should back up and rethink things. Because that's sort of the worst situation as a puzzle designer would be to see someone continuing to try to solve a puzzle from a state where it was impossible. From like they reach an impossible state and they keep working for several minutes without realizing that they were in an impossible state. That's sort of the biggest failure that I can see as a puzzle designer.
Yep.
And then I'm sorry. So there's definitely another thing I can say along those same lines. It's not always just making the puzzle impossible. It's in order to make a puzzle easier. Another thing you can do, which I think is a very important thing, regardless of difficulty, is to make a puzzle deducible. To give a puzzle a main idea, so that the player can say, "Oh, in order to solve this puzzle, I have to do this." And as they get more familiar with the mechanics, the discovery of that main key move will become a lot easier and easier for the player. And so that's a good way to make the puzzles deducible, which I think is what makes puzzles fun. And it also helps, gauge the difficulty a little bit.
And trying to keep things as straightforward or as digestible as possible is a very tall order for puzzle design. And I think especially over the past decade, as everyone knows, it's now far easier to reflow and return a game if you get annoyed, frustrated, or angry at any moment. And with puzzle design, as we said, like another I think very interesting challenge, I'm sure there's one that you've also had to deal with, is different skill levels or different knowledge bases. Because as you said, like there are people who they'll get stuck on that one puzzle you thought was incredibly easy, like yours truly, and then you'll have someone who, a puzzle you thought would be incredibly difficult and no one could figure out, they'll just get through it in like 5 seconds. So how do you approach your game with such a wide spectrum of audience?
Well, the main thing is to restrict your audience. You have to have a target audience in mind. And I would love to design for everybody, but it's just simply not possible with puzzles.
Yeah.
When you have an execution-based game, even someone who's very skilled will still have to learn the execution that your game requires. And someone that's less skilled can still learn, might be at a slower rate, but they can still eventually learn how to do the main executions with the game. Whereas a puzzle game, it's much different. I don't know how to describe it, but there's such a sort of a vast difference between sort of your most skilled puzzle solver and someone who isn't. And so you kind of have to pick a lane when it comes to puzzle design. So in Gentoo Rescue's case, I'm trying to pick somewhere in the middle. So it would be, I don't know if you've played Patrick's Parabox. In the puzzle community, Patrick's Parabox is a game that people consider to be sort of on the easier side of sort of, I don't know, a hardcore puzzle game. It's not a super casual puzzle game like you might see like on a phone app or something. But Patrick's Parabox is definitely a hardcore puzzle game, but it's definitely on the easier side of things. Whereas then on the other side, you might look at, say, Baba Is You or Steven's Sausage Roll or The Golem, games like this. and so these are definitely on the harder side. So I'm trying to sort of strike somewhat of a balance in between those two. I definitely don't want my game to be thought of as an easy game, and so far I think I've succeeded quite well at that. But I also don't want the game to become a very hard and possibly difficult game. And the biggest way that I've approached puzzle design to achieve this is whenever I make a puzzle, I try to never make it trivial. I try to never make it where the player's first idea will work. I try to never make it where players will solve it in 5 or 10 or 20 seconds. There's always some hidden trick in it. It's usually not really a trick. It's hiding in plain sight. The player could have realized it based on their knowledge of the mechanics, but it's something there to trip them up, something that they have to realize and view things maybe with a different point of view. Mm-hmm. And so that's how you prevent the game from being too easy. But then you have to prevent the game from being too hard, from being impossibly hard. And there, the main thing I've strived for is to have simplicity in puzzles, simplicity in mechanics. Just make everything as simple as possible, because when mechanics start working together, that's where the real interesting complexity is. You don't want to add sort of arbitrary complexity on top of things just to make things harder, because that's not very fun.
Mm-hmm. And especially, like, in terms of from a control perspective, you don't want, like, the controls to feel very cumbersome for the player, especially when it comes to, like, movement. Because that's something that the player is going to obviously be doing every second of playing your game. So if that feels frustrating, they're not going to care about any other mechanics or puzzles or things like that. They're just going to be, again, like, harping on that one point that's going to drive them more than likely to quit.
Yep. But with that said, movement is a very interesting way to make something unintuitive at first. That the player would slowly, as they play the game, gain more intuition and be able to see things better. I kind of think of it similar to, I don't know if you're familiar with chess and chess puzzles and things like this, but really good people that solve chess puzzles very quickly is because their visualization skills are just off the charts. They can look at a chess puzzle and immediately just recognize everything and know the exact move. And that can happen in puzzle games too. Like in Steven's Sausage Roll, the very first puzzle took me like 2 or 3 minutes, 5 minutes to solve. I don't remember. It's been a few years, but it was quite difficult for a first puzzle of a puzzle game. And it was all because of the movement. It's using tank controls to move these sausages around. Mm-hmm. And the movement is so finicky, and so it was. You don't really have any intuition for it at the beginning, but I think that builds on itself very well through the course of the game. As you gain more intuition with it, things that were very clunky in the beginning are now second nature, and that sort of progression in skill level, it's almost like an action-based game where you're just getting better at the game outside of your knowledge of the puzzles or anything. You're just getting better at moving around, and that alone gives you some sensation of progression.
Mm-hmm. And I can tell you, it took me a lot longer than 5 minutes to beat one puzzle in Steven's Sausage Roll.
Yeah, that's quite a difficult game.
Mm-hmm. And to kind of build on what you were just saying there, something that I think a lot about in terms of puzzle mechanics is when we talk about kind of more, I don't want to say action-based, but more like maneuver-based puzzle design, that you tend to start to see like these actual like different maneuvers themselves come into play, or different kinds of like skills or things a player can do to solve a puzzle. The game that always comes to my mind when I think about this would be Catherine. I'm not sure if you played that one. This is like an older Atlas title.
No, I have not played.
Yeah, so the thing about it was like you have to climb this tower, so you're pushing and pulling blocks out to kind of create makeshift stairs and ladders and stuff like that. So there's these different maneuvers you can do based on, if you take out certain blocks, it will, things will fall in a specific way. So a lot of the advanced play was memorizing and mastering, okay, if the blocks are arranged in this order, I should, pull out these specific blocks here, to then cause this to fall, to then use to make up a stairwell. And it was a very challenging game, especially if you're trying to do on the higher difficulties. And when I think about that in terms of other puzzle mechanics, to go back to what I was saying at the start about like the Zack likes and Zachtronics, his puzzle games also operate along a similar style, where in Puzzle 1, you're introduced to a method or maneuver that you're supposed to then, integrate in your routine. That will help you with Puzzle 2. And then maybe Puzzle 5 when you do something else. And as you were saying a minute ago, it's like how these things combine that lead to very interesting decisions. But to go back to the notion of difficulty, what makes it very frustrating is, as you were saying earlier about making your game Madison proof, like, what happens if someone completely just closes their eyes and solves a puzzle and has no idea how they solved it, and then the next puzzle takes that same maneuver or that same method and says, we're going to make it even harder? They're just going to be like, what? Like, I have no idea. Like, I'm just done.
Yeah, there's a couple of ways to approach this, and I think the most important one is to not make it possible for someone to close their eyes and solve that first puzzle. That's sort of the bigger issue, and it's not always easy to solve. Sometimes, a certain mechanic that you want to introduce, you don't want to make that first puzzle too hard. You want to kind of lead the player to the solution so they can see how the mechanic works. Um, it's not always easy to make it where it's not something they could solve with their eyes closed. But I think that's more important. There is just making it where there's no way. So there's no way they could beat this puzzle without learning this. So that way I can assume this for future puzzles.
Mhm.
But it's not always possible. And so what you can do to alleviate it is to have reinforcement puzzles where you use a similar idea or even the same idea, but you have just a small twist on it. Where even if someone had like skipped that first puzzle, they would still learn sort of what they needed to learn from that first puzzle from the second puzzle. Maybe from a different perspective, but they would still be able to apply it from then on. And then another thing that that is specifically in Gentoo Rescue is a journal system. So this basically will log all of not just the base mechanics, but also like interesting interactions that you've discovered between mechanics and things like this. So whenever the player discovers those, they go into this log, and so this is really nice if a player stops playing for a year and they come back, they don't feel like they're completely lost and have to start at the beginning of the game. Because I've mentioned Baba Is You several times, and there are a lot of words by the end game of Baba Is You. It's been a few years since I played it, and if I had to go back and play Baba Is You, I probably couldn't solve any of those late game puzzles anymore because I don't remember how some of the things work. I would probably have to start back at the beginning. And so I think that kind of is related to this idea of missing mechanics or like not learning what you were supposed to learn. Well, then you always have this backup of having a journal where you can look up a detailed description of what you were supposed to learn.
Hmm. And speaking of like having a very hard starting puzzle and how much that can just really be a detriment to the game, that reminded me a lot of a Scorn that came out, I want to say 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, if you remember that one.
No, I haven't played Sword either.
Uh, Scorn was
Unfortunately,
was the one that was
oh,
inspired by like the art of H.R. Geiger. And the thing is, like, the first opening puzzle of that game was like head over heels one of the hardest puzzles in that entire game. Like, it churned so many people to in terms of trying to figure it out. And that, I think, is a very interesting challenge and problem when you have puzzles that don't operate on that kind of growth process where, what you do in puzzle 1 will inform puzzle 2, but when like every puzzle is its own unique beast, it then becomes that issue of, okay, let's say puzzle 1 is really bad, but puzzle 3 is super amazing and original. How many people will ever see that puzzle if they get stuck on puzzle 1?
yeah, that's an issue, and that's definitely why I've always tried to make the introductory puzzles easy. When I started out as a game designer, I didn't do that. I wanted to. I sort of subscribed to this idea that every puzzle has to teach something new, and in puzzle 1, I didn't feel like you were learning anything new if it was too easy. And so a lot of my early puzzles were too hard as a result because, of course, the player doesn't think about the game mechanics as the same as the designer. So my
Mm-hmm.
perspective of what's easy, what's hard is just completely off. Um, I've changed on this. So the main thing that made me change is that I want to teach as much as possible in the puzzles. And the very first puzzle, what's the best thing you can teach? It's not actually how the game works or anything related to the game. It's just the controls. So the first puzzle in Gentoo Rescue is, do you know how to move up, down, left, and right? If you can do that, you can win. And so that gives a nice starting off point to at least get the player somewhat invested to the game, to commit a little bit, because hey, they solved the puzzle, before you start throwing some actual mechanics of the game into them.
Mm-hmm. And
And then,
okay.
sorry, yeah, I was going to add one more thing related to this, as far as being concerning, where you have this very difficult puzzle, and then how are they ever going to get to the next section that might be really good if you have this sort of bottleneck, or that you're sort of gatekeeping that whole next section? So another thing that I think is really important is to make as much optional as possible. So say I have 15, 16 puzzles in a certain world, there's probably only 4 or 5 that I require the player to solve. And those are the ones that are like absolutely essential. It's like I have to assume that you know how to do this in order to design future puzzles. So like you must learn this. And then all the other puzzles, they do teach something and they can reinforce things, but they aren't forcing the player to solve them. So if you have that super hard, impossible puzzle and the player gets frustrated, then at least they have the option to just back out of that puzzle and move on, because it's not required.
Mm-hmm. And trying to clue the player in on what is and what isn't required can be its own very interesting challenge. There was a game that I played last year, I linked it to, which is like kind of another like the Zack-like, but a little bit more streamlined approach. And what their whole approach was, this chunk of puzzle. There's 10 different puzzles. You only need to do 5, and then the other 5 are the super optional, mega difficult examples of this. And sometimes I think it is just very important just to like lay it out flatly to the player, saying, okay, you have to do this. You don't have to do this over here. Just focus on this one. If you want to do this, it's fine. If not, no one's judging you otherwise.
Yeah, and that's a challenge to design around. Even as a designer, like I know which puzzles I want the player to play, but maybe I have another puzzle that I want players to play. So in Gentoo Rescue, since I have this nested world system, I might put that puzzle near the main path, but not on the main path. And then it's a question of, how does the player know they don't have to play it? Well, that's a puzzle. That this whole nested puzzle system is the player is solving puzzles while trying to solve some, bigger puzzle, the overworld puzzle. And they only have to solve puzzles that they must land on their path to solving the big puzzle. And so if they're not sure whether a certain puzzle is solvable or not, they can just try to avoid it. And in the case of Gentoo Rescue, most cases that'll be okay. At least most cases on a puzzle where they would want to skip, they probably can skip.
Mm-hmm. And another thing I want to ask you about, like keeping with like puzzles and difficulty, when I've talked to a lot of developers who do puzzle games, there's always that challenge of how much you want to put into a game. And again, especially with something like Gentoo Rescue, when you have the entire meta layer on top of things, as you're like building the game and trying to figure out like how much you want to like throw in, what's your thought process for do I want to include all these different puzzle mechanics and solutions in this game, or do I want to trim things down, both for my sake and the player's sake?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, obviously you don't want too many puzzles, and right now Gentoo Rescue, honestly, there are too many puzzles. There's over 300 puzzles in a game where no puzzle is super easy. So this is already quite a long game, and so trimming is something that I've tried to do as much as possible. But really, I try to let the mechanics dictate the puzzles. So every puzzle just needs to have a new idea in it. And if you see 3 puzzles in a row that all have the same idea, okay, well, 2 of those need to go away. Or at least changed in some way that the idea, even though it's maybe repeated, at least it's sort of viewed from a different angle. And yeah, so I do see some puzzle designers say, "Oh, I I'm making a puzzle game. I want to have 150 puzzles. It's like, no, that's not. You don't think about it in terms of how many puzzles you want. You think about it. You have your mechanics, and honestly, like I take my puzzle mechanics and I go in just a blank puzzle and I play around with the mechanics and try to see something new and interesting that isn't covered in an already existing puzzle. And if I find something, then that's my new puzzle. If I don't find anything, then I don't make a new puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
And some worlds in the game have 8 puzzles. Some worlds have like 18 puzzles. Some mechanics are just more amenable to being used in more interesting ways. And so that's sort of the main bar for me, I think, is just making things be unique as far as the idea that's being used. And beyond that, I'm not too worried about having too many or too few puzzles.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is a really good approach to take that. Design enough that it feels, that the game's not getting repetitive. Because as you said, there is that temptation to just throw 999 different puzzles into your game and just have that as the marking point on the box. But one of the things I think we've seen, especially from some like kind of like newer generational puzzle games, has been trying to again make something that feels like a complete package without being overly long. I'm thinking of something like what's the name of it? Thomas Was Alone, being like a really good example of that, where it's telling a tale along with the puzzle design. So obviously you can't bloat out the puzzles or blow out the story because they both have to work together. And I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier about trying to make puzzle design as a more attractive package for the consumer these days.
One thing that comes to mind about this, as far as a lot of modern puzzle games, is giving players an off ramp.
Mm-hmm.
This is something Baba Is You does. I know Jelly Sticky has a lot of different endings. It's pretty common in puzzle games for like once the player gets, I don't know, 50% of the way done with the game, maybe 60%, 70%,
Mm-hmm.
they get greeted with an ending. They beat the game, yay! But there's still 30% of the game left, and so that's where you sort of you have that content there for your more dedicated players that really want to explore every nook and cranny of the game. But at the same time, you don't make players have to play your game for 50 hours just to reach the credits. And so I think that's probably all I would really ever do to balance the length of the game so that it's not such a grind for players that just want to relax in game that they play every once in a while and eventually reach the ending and are then satisfied. But then maybe you have some more interesting ideas that you want to cover, and so you just throw that in the second portion of the game that's sort of the reach the second ending or the third ending of the game.
Because you will always have that group of people who will just they'll go for every single thing in your game, no matter how convoluted or hard it is.
Oh yeah, I look forward to those people getting their hands on Gentoo Rescue because there's some pretty obscure things that you can do with the whole meta system. This is talking very very like in-game type stuff, and I'm curious to see how long it takes the community to solve some of these puzzles.
Mm-hmm. And kind of building off of like talking about like meta layer meta puzzles. I'm curious what your thoughts on like when we see games that go for like kind of like that like extended like out of the ordinary puzzle. I guess some examples of this would be something like Animal Well from last year that kind of had like once you beat the game, there's another layer of puzzles, and then when you beat that, there's an entire another layer that turns into an ARG, or something like Tunic. That Tunic did a whole lot with its whole kind of using the manual that came with the game as its own puzzle within a puzzle, and like I guess like when the puzzle kind of leaves the gameplay itself and becomes like its own entity.
Oh, I love it. That's just it's a way to take the puzzle solving in your game and give some variety, not just to like the mechanics or the way the puzzles look, but also the way the puzzles are thought about. And like a big portion of Gentoo Rescue is solving these very simple looking but quite difficult but self-contained small puzzles. But then all of a sudden you have to break out and solve these bigger puzzles where you have to do this thing over here, or you may even have to get into an impossible state and do this weird thing, and then you can solve a bigger puzzle. And it's just it's a different way of applying the mechanics that just brings more variety to the experience, and I think these games do this very well as a way to shake things up. And then, of course, in the case of Animal Well, you have these later endings that are also kind of related to what I mentioned with that early off ramp, where players can say like, okay, this game's been good, I've had enough. There's the credits. Let me go play my next game.
And I'm trying to think if there's anything else from a puzzle standpoint I want to ask you. I guess with the finishing up, or as you're working on wrapping up Gentoo Rescue, another challenge of these games, again, going with this notion of more puzzles and more, is knowing when to end it. So I guess, like, for you, like, how do you decide, or how do you decide, like, what's going to be the final puzzle of my game?
It's I don't know. It's really open ended towards the end of the game. There is a big final world, and there's a big fancy animation that comes along with something they have to do, and it's in some way the final puzzle of the main section of the game, but it also kind of unlocks and opens up the world at the same time. So it's a final puzzle, but with some possibilities afterwards. And I don't know. As far as designing it's I know it's really tempting to try to want to use this classic idea of take everything the player has ever learned and somehow work it into this one giant puzzle. This is an idea I wanted to do, but of course it just gets way too hard and way out of scope.
Yeah.
So really, I mean, I don't really treat the final puzzle any differently than any other puzzle. It's more about sort of the impact that has on the world opening up afterwards for the player to still have more places to explore, but being done with sort of the main content.
Right. I don't think there's anything else to bring up. I guess, from your side, any other points or topics about Gen 2 or puzzle design that you'd like to discuss?
I mean, let me just run through sort of the main points I think are interesting. I know we've talked about a few of these. So the first thing for puzzles is just having them be as deducible as possible. I know there's a lot of discussion. Puzzles are supposed to have a unique solution. You need a unique solution for puzzles, and I subscribe to that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think even more important than having a unique solution is having a unique, interesting solution that the player can deduce their way towards. Because you can very easily take a puzzle and make it have a unique solution that isn't so much of a good puzzle because the player feels like they have to trial and error their way to the solution or brute force a solution, which isn't fun. And so I think, yeah, the main takeaway that I would say, just related to puzzle design in general, is just to make everything as deducible as possible. And then we've talked a little bit about puzzle design. My ideal puzzle design is mostly on simplicity. I think I mentioned already that making things more difficult through ways of complexity is typically not good and not a fun way to play because it sort of again leads to that trial and error type of system.
Mm-hmm.
And then other than that, yeah, we've already discussed all the meta puzzles and and how you get the player in the right mindset to go from one puzzle to the next. Yeah, I think that's all for me.
All right. Yeah, and to avoiding like brute forcing, that again, like to go back to what you were saying earlier about the difficulty when it comes to like churn or keeping the player invested, is that it's hard, I think, to know like as a designer like where the player is at, I guess, like skill wise. So I guess that's another interesting question for you. Like in terms of building the required puzzles for Gen 2, what kind of like approach you take to like kind of figure out, okay, I want to use these puzzles to teach the player, mechanism A, which I can then, give them a more horror version of that or a required version of that in the next world or the next section.
Yeah, so it mostly comes about from the mechanics and what the player needs to know about the mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, I'll just use the spring. It's in the demo right now for Next Fest and Gentoo Rescue. The player learns about the spring. So I try to break apart all of the mechanics they need to learn. So for the spring, they first need to learn just a very basic. A spring causes you to bounce one tile away from a wall. So that's definitely the first puzzle has to be required. Then what else do they need to know? they need to understand that this works even when they're next to a wall. So in essence, they can bounce backwards and use this previous idea. They can bounce backwards with the spring and use that to sort of go unintuitively, but in the opposite direction. So that's another required puzzle. And you just go down the list of like what are all the different ways I can use a spring, and which of those are the like of utmost importance. Which of those come up a lot more throughout the rest of the game, and there's probably going to be 4 or 5. I think I actually have 7 required puzzles for the spring, which is probably the biggest in the game. You're gonna get those required puzzles that you need from just those, and then you have to be very careful not to make those required puzzles too difficult. That's not always easy, but yeah, you take those ones that teach those main uses of the mechanic, and you try to teach them in such a way that players won't get stumped forever on those puzzles.
And trying to like have like the requirements for certain puzzle design, that I think is another very interesting point. Like there have been some puzzle games that kind of go like a MacGuffin reward that you must get 10 stars in order to unlock the next world. Or I think Bob was you did something similar. Like different puzzles will reward you with different resources or keys that will unlock different paths. So I guess as an interesting question for you, in terms of like going off the beaten path, like now we're talking about optional puzzles, the stuff that, a common or casual player will probably never see. What is your approach when it's time for that? When you're going like really, optional, it's no longer about being easy, it's about testing the player.
Well, I think the optional puzzles are pretty similar to the required puzzles, except maybe the main idea they have isn't as essential for the player to know. So you have this main idea that you think can make a good puzzle, and you make it, but this lesson that puzzle teaches the player doesn't really need to know in future worlds. That all of a sudden is now an optional puzzle. Doesn't mean the puzzles have to be 100 times harder than the other puzzles. It just means that it's not necessary. And then just inevitably some of these puzzles will be 100 times harder. So those we try to hide off, just far away from the main path. We make it so in Gentoo Rescue, the fact that the whole world system is a puzzle, it's very easy for me to say, oh, well, this puzzle's really hard. Let me just make it hard to reach. And so that way I can just ensure that no one's going to accidentally just stumble onto this like impossibly hard puzzle when they've, just first started with a new world.
And I guess that's an interesting question for you. What kind of puzzles are like your personal favorites, and what are some of your least favorite puzzles that you like to see in games?
I've kind of alluded to this, but I really don't like complicated puzzles. I want to look at the puzzle and have some sense of. I want to be able to parse the puzzle very quickly. I want to, even if I don't have the solution in my head, I want to be able to fit sort of all the elements in my head. I don't want to have to, take notes or anything like that. So I much prefer like single screen puzzles where, all the information is in front of you and everything in the puzzle you either already know or you have learned enough so that you can make theories about how you can solve it. And then as far as the making theories part, if a puzzle requires the player to make a theory, I think it's important that the puzzle makes it easy for the player to test their theory. So what I mean is, if you have a puzzle that requires the player to do something completely new, and maybe the player could have some intuition about it, then they make a theory. It's like, oh, maybe I need to do this. Then it should be relatively easy for the player to test their hypothesis. It shouldn't be like impossibly hard for the player to test their hypothesis and then find out it was wrong, and then now they spent all this extra time on something that doesn't work. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of puzzles that do that have like a lot of pitfalls like that, or a lot of red herrings. So another thing that I see in a lot of puzzle games, none of the successful ones, all the successful ones do this really well, but some of the puzzle games I don't like as much, they might have a lot of red herrings. They have a lot of elements in the puzzle that aren't needed, that are there. Their entire purpose for being there is just to trick me.
Hmm.
I want to be able to say, oh, this is in this puzzle. Why did the designer put that in the puzzle? I must have to use it some way. Oh, I have to use it like this, and that gives me a way to deduce my way through the puzzle. But all of a sudden, if that's there just because just by random chance, then I have no sense of direction. I have no compass on how to navigate this puzzle, and so I definitely not a big fan of that.
Hmm. Yeah, man, I think I'm very similar to that. I'm not a fan when it feels like the puzzle is just like 17 different disconnected parts that you're trying to figure out here and there. I think some of the ones that I do like when it feels like it's like a puzzle within a larger puzzle, where it's kind of like each part of the screen is like its own little puzzle that pushes a block or sets something up for like the next puzzle. So it turns out there's almost like a Rube Goldberg machine of everything is bouncing around to get this one actual solution.
Yeah, I like that as well. I mentioned earlier, like I prefer single screen
Yeah.
puzzles while I'm sitting here talking about my game that has meta puzzles in it, which are definitely not single screen puzzles because you have to connect different parts together. And I do like these different parts connecting. It's just that it can very easily get overwhelming because you
Hmm.
don't necessarily have all the information in front of you. And so I think in those situations it can be fine as long as your options are basically as limited as possible. So that way you don't get the sense of uncertainty. It's like, oh, can I do this? I got to go look at this other screen. And then it's like, can I do this? And then you start to feel like you have to take notes and
Yeah.
and things like that. And yeah, I'm not a big fan of that.
Hmm. Yeah, same way. Like if there's like information in one room that you have to either memorize or write down and bring into another room, that always annoys me because with my short-term memory, I'm going to forget that. I'll have to go back and forth like 20 different times.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think yeah, just complete information, give the player everything they need to know. Maybe they have to figure some things out, but um, give them some playground to experiment if they have to figure something out.
So, I guess to begin to wrap things up for our chat tonight, so we are recording this just at the beginning of March. We are somewhat near the middle of the end of Next Fest right now. So, do you have an estimated release date for Gen 2?
Yeah, right now the official release date is April, and I'm gonna go ahead and say it's probably around middle of April-ish, but yeah, currently unannounced.
Mm-hmm. And oh, I just actually thought of one other kind of bigger question I want to ask you about. One thing that always comes up when I talk about puzzle design and puzzle gameplay with developers is playtesting, and of course we mentioned this back at the start. But in terms of getting feedback from like consumers and other playtesters, how as a puzzle developer do you parse that in terms of you know are people finding this game too easy, too hard? Are they figuring out? Are they not figuring out? Like, how do you like take that feedback in?
Well, so for playtesting for Gentoo Rescue, I haven't had an overwhelming number of
Hmm.
playtesters. I've had a small enough number where I can just watch their gameplay. I've had a few playtesters that I've been fortunate enough to send me video of them, playing through the entire game, and I've watched, 20, 30 hours of gameplay of a lot of players. And just by watching, you can see a lot. You can see when they get tripped up by something that you didn't intend. You can see when they completely circumvent this pitfall you led for them and they didn't fall into it at all, and that's also an issue. And so that's sort of the best way I think is just watching the gameplay. On a larger scale, if I say I had 100 or 200 playtesters, then it would really be about the metrics. You would have to record metrics of like how long does this puzzle take, how many moves did they do, how many times did they restart or undo, or things like this to get a sense, from puzzle to puzzle, which ones are the hard ones essentially.
Like I remember when I interviewed one of the developers from Crow Team about the first House Principle. I remember how they said they use like a an AI program to try and figure out as many different solutions to a puzzle as one can be. So I guess that can actually be like one final question for you. Like you've talked during this cast about like how different puzzles can either have like one fixed solution. We mentioned, of course, the optimization puzzles of the Zach Lakes. I guess like from your own perspective, do you prefer puzzles to be like a very much a singular, this is the exact solution to it? Or do you like to have a little bit more open endedness to like your puzzles?
It depends from game to game. Generally, if it's a puzzle game, I think it should have a unique solution.
Mhm.
It More important than a unique solution, though, is having a deducible solution, so something that allows the player to step through the puzzle. But in practice, those tend to go hand in hand. If there's two solutions, it might be harder for the player to say, "Oh, this must be the right choice," because no, it actually might not be. There might be another way to do it,
Mhm.
and that fact kind of limits their ability to make deductions throughout the puzzle. But then, in terms of like Zack-like games, those games are more about optimizations, and I don't sort of think of them in the same way as puzzle games. And there, the richness of the game is all the creativity and tricks you can play in optimizing your solution. And so for those games, I think that's perfect. Like that's not something that would work at all in a traditional puzzle game like Gentoo Rescue. Um, because in Gentoo Rescue, even when I did have puzzles that had multiple solutions, the other solution, like one solution was always worse than the other. So why would I ever allow it? I would just take the more interesting solution and try to force that to be the main solution.
All right.
But then in Zach likes, you have multiple solutions, and maybe the most optimal solution is way too hard, and you would not expect most of your players
Mhm.
to ever even consider it. And so, yeah, it makes sense to have the bar be, lowered quite a bit, just to, consider that puzzle be completed. And then I guess I do have one more thing to add related to this is that you mentioned that in the Talos principle they wrote an AI to solve a puzzle. I've done the same actually for Gentoo Rescue. I wrote a solver. I say AI. I know nowadays when people say AI, they assume talking about machine learning or LLMs or things like this. In my case, it's just an A-star algorithm. I learned it in artificial intelligence class, so I still call it AI, even though it's not what most people think of when they hear AI. But essentially, yeah, it'll essentially just brute force puzzles, and I can run the solver to see the most optimal solution, the one that uses the fewest moves. And then if I want to be certain that there's no other solution, I can step through the puzzle and say, okay, starting from this position, can I solve it? Starting from this position, can I solve it? And that way I can guarantee that the player has to do the solution that I've intended.
I think I'm just about out of questions for you. Um, hmm. Is anything else that pops into your mind before we say goodnight?
I mean, there's another tangent. I don't know how related to puzzle design it is, but it is related to the solver we just talked about.
Mm-hmm.
This took a lot of work and effort to get this to work. This solver that could, you give it a puzzle and it can give you a solution. But that's useful beyond just puzzle design. It makes puzzle design faster because you can more quickly iterate and be sure that your solution's the only one. But it's also been a very, very useful tool in just general game dev, like debugging or searching for bug, or I guess play testing is a different way to say it. Just testing in general. Because using the solver, what I can do is just have it simulate just completely random puzzles, run the solver on it, and look for any inconsistencies in the move logic.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, for a while I was running this thing like every night. It would go through a couple 100,000 puzzles and find if any puzzle had some unexpected behavior on it. And that's sort of been a way that I've found a lot of bugs early on. This sort of automated process.
I think with that, I'm again like we want to talk about other genres. We can be here for a very long time, but I guess to wrap things up for our chat then for tonight, I guess here's the question I always like to ask developers: like, do you have an idea for what your next game will be after Gen 2?
No, I have a few ideas bouncing around in my head, some of which are puzzle, some of which are not. So I mentioned my background was in competitive games. I actually competed, like I call it professionally. I mean, I didn't make any professional money, but I competed in a arena first-person shooter called Diabotical
Okay.
for a couple of years, and also in another. It's a strategic shooter. It's now dead, but it's called Limniscate. I don't know if you ever heard of this. It was a turn-based shooter with like time travel elements in it, and that was very intriguing. And I like both of these games. They played very differently, Diabolical and Limniscate. And so, yeah, maybe I could come up with something related to those. But then I also already have some puzzle ideas too, so maybe I'll just stay with my stay with my background in puzzles.
All right. So, do you have any final thoughts on puzzle design? Anything you'd like to say to any fans watching? Just something to take us out on for tonight.
I mean, I've been the game has done well in Next Fest. A lot of people are finding Gentoo Rescue for the first time, and I've gotten a lot of positive feedback. It's sort of surreal to see just look in a puzzle Discord and you see people talking about Gentoo Rescue, how they're excited about it. It's going to be the game of the year 2025, and I'm like, wow, I never expected to read something like that from someone I've never met. And so yeah, just much love to anyone who's tried the demo this week and found it and went ahead and wishlisted it. Yeah, all the best to people that have enjoyed the game.
Right, sounds good. So, with that, I think we'll say goodnight. So, in terms of social media, any you want to mention for people where people can find you?
Yeah, I'm on Blue Sky, and let me see, what's my ID? Yeah, Jagriff, Jagriff, on Blue Sky. I also have two Twitter accounts that I very sparingly use. One is Jagriff, and then one is Gentoo Rescue. And then outside of that, I'm most active on Discord. If you ever need to reach out to me, Blue Sky is fine, but Discord's probably going to get a faster response.
All right. Well, Jagriff, again, thank you so much for reaching out, and best of luck with the finishing and the release of Gentoo Rescue.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for having me here, and I'm good luck on the rest of Next Fest.
Yep. Hopefully by the time people are watching this, I'll be wrapped up with the Next Fest coverage, but who knows, given all the demos I'm downloading. So, for everyone watching, be sure to check out Gentoo Rescue, and I'll include a link to the store page down below. Again, if you are a developer working on an upcoming game or just want to chat game dev with me, please reach out. Buy all the copies of the book, do all the YouTube subscribing and liking and all that great stuff. And with that, we will say goodnight for now. So thank you again for watching, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where I examine the art and science of games. Until next time, everybody, have a great night.